Good afternoon. I'm in Eastern time, so I'm saying good afternoon, but I know some of you are in on earlier time zones, so good morning to you. My name is Morna Ballantyne, and I serve as the Executive Director of Childcare Now, Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association. And I just want to give a very big welcome to all of you who have joined this webinar on the federal budget that was tabled in the House of Commons on November 4th. The webinar is in English, but we have arranged for simultaneous translation, simultaneous interpretation into French. If you would prefer to follow the presentations in French, you should find the icon at your bottom of your screen, the interpretation icon, and choose French. And then you will hear the voice of the interpreters throughout, and you can switch to either language at any time, back and forth. We want to invite everyone to participate in the webinar using the chat function. We won't have a Q&A function. We're going to depend on the chat function. So please feel free to post your comments and your questions in either English or French. And after the brief presentations by our panelists, there's going to be an opportunity for them to discuss issues and questions that you raise in the chat box. So let me begin by acknowledging that Childcare Now recognizes and deeply appreciates that our organization exists and is active on the unceded treaty and contested lands and waters. The treaty and contested lands and waters across Turtle Island. As a national advocacy organization, our organization respects and affirms the inherent rights, the historical claims, and the treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands and waters with whom we strive to work in solidarity. As we always do at the start of every meeting we convene, we wish to draw attention to the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and to advance the process of reconciliation. And we note in particular that call number 12 calls upon all governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. So the purpose of this webinar is to share information about what is in and what's not in the federal budget, now in front of the House of Commons and the Senate. I'm going to begin by briefly sharing Childcare Now's analysis, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to share their perspectives. So today we're going to hear from David McDonald. He's the senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and he coordinated the development this year, as he has done in past years, of Canada's alternative federal budget. And of course, for many years, I know many of you know this, David has followed childcare policy developments very closely and has written extensively on the subject. We also have as a panelist Leila Sarangi, who's the National Director of Campaign 2000, which is Canada's national coalition to end child and family poverty. It's a coalition that came together in response to a 1989 unanimous all-party federal resolution to end child poverty by the year 2000. And we're going to hear from two well-known childcare advocates, Sharon Gregson, the spokesperson for BC's $10 a day campaign, and Carolyn Ferns, who serves as the public policy and government relations coordinator for the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. And I just want to note that Leila and Sharon and Carolyn also serve on Childcare Now's board of directors. So briefly, what's in the federal budget for childcare? The good news? Well, the budget does not cancel the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program. The bad, and in my view, dangerous news is that the federal transfers to other levels of government in support of the program are going to be adjusted upwards by only 3% in a year and only as of April 1st, 2027. That's barely enough to offset the impact of inflation if the rates don't go up dramatically. The rate of inflation doesn't go up. There are no new federal funds in the budget to build or operate new programs. There are no new federal funds to address the fact that public funding for the existing programs is inadequate. And there are no new federal funds to address the ongoing workforce crisis. No additional funds to improve compensation or improve working conditions, which we all know are the learning and care conditions for children. The federal finance minister says that the budget protects the $10 a day program. But you can't protect a program under strain without strengthening it. The budget doesn't strengthen, it weakens. It breaks the Liberal government's promise in 2021 that transfer payments for early learning and childcare would increase based on what is needed to continuously improve the program. Everywhere in Canada, the progress made since 2021 with respect to childcare is at risk of being rolled back. The hope we all had of more positive change going forward is diminished. Our hope that governments would fund so that we can raise quality, provide workforce supports, ensure greater inclusion of vulnerable children and families, improve access for low-income earners, build more and better facilities close to where children live. The funding for all of that is just not there. So our hopes on that front have been diminished. The federal budget weakens the hand of the federal negotiators as they seek to renew the policy and financial support of the province and territories for the $10 a day plan. So we know that, and Carolyn's going to address this, that the Ontario government and the federal government agreed to a 1-year extension of the Canada-wide program in lieu of a 5-year extension, and 2 provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta, are still in negotiations. And of course, negotiations also have to take place with respect to the next 5-year action plans. So by not putting more money in the budget, not having more on the table to offer, the federal government's hands at the bargaining table are much weaker. The failure of the federal budget to invest in childcare lowers Canada's ability to build an independent and a more sustainable economy. It just doesn't make sense to weaken one of the most important bridges that parents, and especially mothers, need to access or stay in the paid labor force, especially in a full-time basis. For advocates, I would say Budget 2025 is also dangerous because without more public funding, Canada can't make access to the $10 a day program more universal. And when governments limit the availability of essential publicly funded programs, they lose popular support. They become contentious, and often they start to fall apart. Also, and I want to make this point, scarcity of public funds for childcare breeds divisions over how scarce funds should be spent. Should the funds be used to meet the $10 a day fee commitment, or should they be put to expanding the system? Should we be creating more spaces if there's not enough money to properly fund the ones that we have? If there's not enough government funding, should parent fees be raised? Parents have enjoyed sufficient fee reductions up until now. Is it not now the turn for educators to earn more? It's essential, I think, Childcare Now thinks, that those who share the objective of a high-quality, universal, primarily not-for-profit program of childcare remain united and together in a demand for greater public investment in the $10 a day program. We have to keep the pressure on the federal government to keep its promises, including the ones the Liberals made in the last election. If anything is a generational public investment that delivers multiple short-term and long-term returns for families, for children, for the country, for the economy, it has to be childcare. We also have to put similar demands forward and pressure on provincial and territorial governments. So Childcare Now is going to be relaunching our Stand on Guard for Childcare campaign. We're determined to stop the rollbacks and get back to building a high-quality childcare system for all. And we hope that you'll join us. Hope you go to our website, childcarenow.ca, sign up for our mailing list, take out a membership if you can, sign your name to our ongoing petition, and just do whatever you can in your communities to help defend, protect, but most importantly, expand and strengthen the childcare program. Stay tuned for more calls to action. Thank you. So that's our brief introductory statement, what's in the budget. I want to now turn to David McDonald, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, to give us his perspective and his knowledge of what is in the budget about childcare, but beyond childcare. What kind of vision does the budget put forward? What would we have, and what would the alternative federal budget have proposed instead? Thanks, David. Go ahead.
Sure thing. Well, thanks so much for the invitation today, Morna, and to Childcare Now to present to folks. Let's start off with some good news after this introduction of the budget, which is relatively bad news. The alternative federal budget has a great chapter this year on childcare, and I wanted to go over some of the items that we came up with for that chapter. First of all, it's pretty clear that we need to fund sufficient access, not just a number of spaces, but a coverage rate. And so the alternative budget proposes by 2031 that we create 6.5 spaces for every 10 children under the age of 6 to ensure that parents can find childcare spaces near where they live. We need to push the alternative federal budget would push provinces to providing detailed 5-year plans on their nonprofit expansion. So far, the expansion under CWELC has been 2/3 for profit, with the difference being nonprofit and homes. This so far has been a for-profit expansion, and that has to stop. And so we need to push provinces into detailed municipal level planning in terms of how the nonprofit sector is going to expand. We need to improve wage scales and benefits for ECEs, benefits like pensions, to improve retention rates. We need to amend the childcare expansion loan program and make it a grants program, particularly for nonprofit centers. We need to ensure that when new federal housing builds happen, that we locate childcare within those new builds to ensure that childcare is right there and built into the plans when it does come to expansion. And the chapter has more on this. However, we believe it's now time to begin planning for comprehensive expansion of school-aged care. So this is before and after school care. How can we ensure that that part of the childcare system is affordable? At this point, it's actually, for most folks, a lot less expensive to get full day care than it is to get before and after school care because the full day care is under the CWELC agreements, whereas the before and after school care is not. So when it comes to the budget itself, Morna's quite right that the escalator on the CWELC transfers to the provinces will stay at 3%, which will be roughly the increase in wages that we will see. There is no broader increase, and so there is no increase built in there to improve coverage rates. The goal in the AFB was 6.5 spaces for 10 kids. The goal in the CWELC agreements for most provinces was actually 5.9 spaces per 10 kids. The big provinces are nowhere near that, though. Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta have a long ways to go. Even if they meet their CWELC commitments in terms of number of spaces created, they will be a long ways from 6 spaces for every 10 kids not in school. Quebec and PEI are already there, but without more funds for expansion, the situation in the other big provinces outside of Quebec is going to be one of long wait lists and frustrated parents unable to find these $10 a day spaces, or in those 3 provinces, actually probably more like $20 a day, even after these agreements end. The Early Learning and Childcare Infrastructure Fund that was introduced in Budget 2022 has 1 year left. And so this year it is distributing $200 million. Next year it'll distribute $200 million, and we will not see an extension to it. One of the features of the budgetary cuts that have come down to most departments is that they will allow programs that are expiring to expire and not renew them. And so I think the Early Learning and Child Care Infrastructure Fund will be one of those programs. Broadly, most departments in the federal government are going to make 15% operational cuts over the next 3 years. And that is to fund an almost dollar for dollar increase in the defense budget. The defense budget will increase by about 40% over the next 3 years. And so this isn't an austerity budget in the aggregate. It's a massive realignment of operational spending away from most departments and towards defense. So ESDC, for its part, which administers these childcare transfers, most of the savings, quote unquote, that they will be booking over the next 3 years is in straight up program cuts. And so this isn't to say that the Seawalk transfers to the provinces are in jeopardy. They don't seem to be at this point. But ESDC in general will be experiencing substantial program cuts over the next 3 years. One of the focuses of this budget was a differentiation of operating versus capital expenditures. And so capital expenditures here means basically any specific transfer to someone else, provinces, municipalities, businesses, that will build something physical. That's capital. They've also included basically almost all of the corporate income tax breaks or tax loopholes on the corporate side. Those all count as capital under this new rubric. This didn't gain a lot of attention, but it is clearly it's clearly guiding the spending decisions. And the idea here of separating capital versus operating expenditure is that the capital budgets can be allowed to expand. You can run deficits on the capital side, but operating expenditure must be cut back in order for it to be quote unquote balanced. And so capital good, operating bad, operating to be cut, capital to be expanded. And particularly where operating will be cut, it'll be transferred to defense. And so this is one of the lessons I think of this budget is that in terms of advocacy going forward, it will become much more challenging for childcare in terms of retention and proper wages for ECEs, because that is clearly on the operating side. There will just be no more federal money for that. There are opportunities potentially on the capital side, though, in terms of where might we find something in the future going forward. There is a substantial new Build Community Strong Fund. It's at this point a massive slush fund, so it has very little definition to it. About half of it is simply rating two existing funds, which is the Canada Community Buildings Fund and the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund. Those are both rated, and they make up about half of the value of the Build Community Strong Fund. So half of it is new money, half of it is just a reannouncement. This will largely be a transfer to provinces that is meant to be then transferred to cities, and the cities then decide how this could be spent. This has already been spent and will likely continue to be spent supporting things like community centers, among other things. There could be childcare in these community centers. Although certainly, there is some concern that this is a direct quote from the budget. Applicants, quote unquote, would be required to seek private sector investment, including private investment leverage through the Canada Infrastructure Bank financing. This, I'm not sure, is going to apply to community centers or childcare centers. But it does create potentially an opportunity to expand capital. The problem is that none of it will cover new operating expenses. And the Health Infrastructure Fund, which is part of this Build Community Strong Fund, sort of exemplifies this dichotomy. So you can use the Health Infrastructure Fund, which is new this year, to build things like new emergency rooms, but you cannot use the Health Infrastructure Fund to staff new emergency rooms. In the case of emergency rooms, the problem generally isn't that there's a lack of space to do the emergency rooming in. The problem generally is that there's a lack of staff to do the emergency care. And so in this case, you could build new emergency rooms, but you can't staff them. And so that may well be one of the dilemmas that's happening with childcare as well, is that there may be a way to access some of these funds because it seems like a lot of the responsibility will be devolved down to the provincial or even municipal levels to spend potentially on childcare. The challenge is that you might be able to build childcare centers, but you won't be able to staff them with federal money. And
David, I'm
so
going to just
I will
ask
wrap
you
up there and pass it
yeah,
off to the next speaker.
thank you so much, David. We'll get back to some of the points that you raised, including this division between operational funding side of the ledger and spending. Thank you. Layla, can I ask you to give your perspective on the budget?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Morna. It's an honor to be here and share my perspective. I'm going to really take the angle of child and family poverty. So, as you mentioned at the top, I'm the National Director of Campaign 2000, which is a pan Canadian coalition of community and nonprofit organizations from across the country working to end child and family poverty. And we came about in response to that 1989 promise to end child poverty by the year 2000, that unanimous federal resolution. So we are now 25 years past that goalpost. This budget is framed as a generational investment, but I want to be really clear. We've missed an opportunity to lift a generation of children out of poverty because the federal government failed to adequately invest in children and families. Today, poverty reduction is guided by a legislated target, and that is to cut poverty in half by 2030, which is just over 4 years away. But the latest data is showing that child poverty has doubled since 2020. Our research reveals that more children are falling into poverty, and they're falling into deeper poverty, meaning that families have even less incomes to meet their basic needs. And at the same time, wealth and incomes are concentrating at the top. Inequality is widening and becoming more entrenched. This budget was released on the opening day of the United Nations Second World Summit on Social Development, where heads of states and 14,000 delegates convened in Doha, Qatar, to recommit to poverty eradication, decent work, and ending inequalities for all. I was there as part of Canada's delegation that they sent, and as leaders from governments and civil society from across the globe gathered to discuss how to accelerate progress, our federal government released a budget that treats social investment as operational expenditures to be restrained, not as economic investments that build stronger and fairer futures. Tomorrow is the National Day of the Child, which marks Canada's ratification of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And November 24th, next Monday, is the anniversary that federal resolution passed to end child poverty. These are not symbolic dates. These are the Canadian values that should be driving our investments. Childhood poverty is a serious violation of the right to an adequate standard of living, and it undermines all areas of a child's life, including physical health, cognitive development, and educational attainment, their socioeconomic well-being. It puts them on a path to lowered economic opportunities, chronic illness, and intergenerational poverty. And in Canada, it's disproportionately experienced by children and families from marginalized communities. So the budget, as has been mentioned, has promised to protect vital social programs such as pharmacare and dental care and some childcare, but it's really seeking to protect the status quo. It's not building out on those programs. And so the effect is going to be that trend of rising poverty and rising inequality will not be stopped. That's what's going to continue. The Canada Child Benefit, which is a program that we look at and analyze, it's really important and can be a powerful mechanism to lift children out of poverty. It remains indexed to inflation. That means payments in this fiscal year are set to increase by about 5%. And after that, they're expected to increase at about 2.7% annually until 2030. But these inflationary increases are not robust enough to lift those children who are in deep poverty. We also have the National School Food Program, which will be made permanent, and this is good. Children have the right to adequate nutrition. But if that right was the goal, though, then we cannot ignore the research that shows food insecurity is better addressed with increased incomes and reduced food prices, which are not in the budget. Access to quality and accessible childcare can also be a really important equalizer for children and families with low incomes. It enables families, as Morna said, particularly mothers, to enter into the workforce. But research also shows that it can lead to significant positive long-term benefits for children, including improved cognitive, social, emotional, and health outcomes. So it can reverse or intervene in those negative outcomes that children in poverty can face. But in the current plan, too many low-income children are excluded from the national child care system. We're really concerned that this generational budget is going to fail yet another generation of children by ignoring their rights. Campaign 2000 has put forward 58 recommendations to the federal government. But there's a couple that I'll just highlight here that are probably the most important for this conversation. We have put forward a $0 to $10 a day sliding scale childcare fee system where families with low or no income pay nothing for childcare. They have free access to childcare and would ensure that those children can access childcare when they need it and where they need it. We're also recommending broadening access to the Canada Child Benefit to make it easier for children who are in foster care, kinship, or customary care arrangements to be able to access that benefit and to remove immigration status as a requirement for eligibility, which is an arbitrary requirement. Alongside David and the CCPA, we are advocating for a low income supplement to the Canada Child Benefit that would target families in low income. If implemented in the way that it's modeled in the alternative federal budget, it would drastically and immediately cut rates of child poverty in half. So if you want to take action with Campaign 2000, we have a sign-on statement. It's on our website, and I think the link is going to be put into the chat. We have a statement that you can endorse. You can also sign up to our mailing list to receive further notifications, and you can use our research in your own research and advocacy. I believe the latest report card is also being linked in that chat. Child poverty, it's not inevitable. It is a policy choice. Canada has the levers and the resources and the capacity to change this trajectory. It does require bold action and real investment. This really, to us, is the most important nation building project of all, and we can't afford to fail another generation of children.
Layla, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for your advocacy and childcare advocacy of Campaign 2000 and for those recommendations. So those links that you mentioned are in the chat. We really encourage people to get involved in the coalition and sign on to the calls to action that you've made. And I'm sure there's going to be some questions for you later. I'm going to turn now to Sharon first. Sharon, wonderful BC advocate, spokesperson for the $10 a day campaign. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Morna. And people who do Zoom will know there's nothing worse than having your huge image pinned on the screen instead of being a little tile in a box. So thank you for the opportunity to chat with you all today and bring you some information from British Columbia. So you might not know, we were certainly shocked to discover that the top 5 most expensive cities for childcare in Canada are now all in BC. So finally we beat Toronto at something, but unfortunately it's the cost of childcare. And did you know that childcare fees in Vancouver have now topped $3,000 a month for one child? And that's because in BC, 90% of all our childcare in the province relies on market-based fees. So even with the $900 fee reduction that the provincial government provides for children under 3, that leaves parents still paying up to $2,100 a month for a childcare space. We are very aware that 9 other provinces and territories in Canada have capped all their provincial fees, either at 10 a day or 15 in Alberta or 22 in Ontario and just over $9 in Quebec. And we certainly know that childcare is not perfect anywhere in Canada, but we are struggling to understand why it is that other jurisdictions can cap fees across their entire province when they receive the same per-child funding from the federal government as BC does. And BC launched its 10-a-day plan years before other provinces, and only 10% of our childcare is currently operating as a 10-a-day space. It's a big problem for us. Currently, the federal government contributes more to BC childcare each year than our province does. And while we absolutely agree that a significant increase in federal funding is required, particularly around capital, as David described, we need more meaningful progress Canada-wide. At least the federal budget has a 3% inflationary increase. Our BC budget has been flatlined for childcare from 2024 through 28. And as we all know, a flatlined budget in these inflationary times is essentially a reduced budget. So despite an early start in British Columbia and a provincial commitment to universal 10-a-day childcare even before any CWELC agreements were signed, still in BC, only 75% of children 0 to 12 have no access to licensed childcare at all. As I said, only 10% of our childcare is a 10-a-day space. And yet, in our CWELC agreement, our province agreed to prioritize the creation of nonprofit and public spaces, but the majority of new spaces in our province that have opened are for-profit. We agreed to work towards an average fee of 10 a day, but average fees under 6 are twice as high now, with no further fee reductions in process, and ongoing reports confirm higher fees in for-profit settings. There was an agreement to develop and a commitment to implementing a wage grid for educators, and it is absolutely nowhere to be seen. In fact, because low wages of educators, as you all on this call will know, almost always women and often racialized women, because wages have stagnated with a $6 an hour wage top-up, not a wage grid, we see programs closing because they cannot recruit or retain qualified staff. Just on the Sunshine Coast last month, 2 YMCA programs were closed to parents with a month's notice because of staffing. So as popular and life-changing as 10 a day is for families, many operators are now considering opting out of 10 a day, actually not just stalled progress, but moving backwards, going back to market-based fees because the provincial funding does not cover even current wages for educators and certainly doesn't implement the quality objectives of our early learning framework. The good news, if there is any, is that the economist Jim Stanford's analysis, which is in the chat, provides evidence that our government actually made money in 2024 because more parents were able to go to work. So they made money on their investments, a profit actually. So the bottom line in BC is that we need more public investment, federally and provincially. And we need the province to be held accountable for delivering on its commitments and delivering on its existing CWELC agreement. We need a better action plan for the next 5-year agreement for sure. We want them to finish what they started, what the public wants, what families need, and definitely what British Columbians voted for and still support. The 10-a-day plan where families truly have affordable childcare and importantly, educators are fairly compensated. And so we have relaunched our 10-a-day campaign, and we have lots of action tools for people to take. But I am hoping, Rachel, that you'll show our newly released video, which is garnering a lot of attention. And I'll put in the chat an op-ed, which was just released today.
The BC government says it wants our province to get to work. But how are we supposed to get to work if we can't find or afford childcare? They promise $10 a day childcare, affordable, reliable care that helps parents work, businesses grow, and our economy thrive. Our finance minister should know this isn't just social policy, it's smart economics. Every dollar invested in childcare helps families, strengthens our workforce, and grows BC's economy. It's time to deliver. Let BC parents work. Finish what you promised. $10 a day, now.
Thank you, Sharon. Lots of hearts going up for that video and also for your presentation. Really appreciate it. And Carolyn, I'm turning it over to you now. And Sharon, I'm sure there will be questions about BC, as there will be about Ontario, I'm sure, Carolyn, but go ahead.
Great, thanks, Morna. How can I follow Sharon's awesome video? That was great, Sharon. I think we should do something similar here in Ontario for sure. So the current context here in Ontario, for those who've been following along, is that, of course, we've been waiting to see if our provincial government would sign an agreement to extend the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system here in Ontario. They had agreed in principle back in March, But then we had months of radio silence and no negotiations happening between the two governments. And now, we've heard, I think it was released by our Minister of Education, directly in a letter to parents in the evening of November the 10th, that they had reached, not yet signed, still signing, but reached an agreement with the federal government for a 1-year extension of the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreement. And I'll get back into exactly what's in that 1-year extension in a minute. But first, just to check in on where things have gone over the course of the last agreement, where we are in Ontario. So on affordability, Ontario used to have the highest childcare fees in the country, as Sharon mentioned. And, fees for childcare were, well over $1,000 for families. And then, we saw rates cut in half and then lowered each year. And so we're now at a cap of $22 a day, which they average as being about $19 a day average for childcare programs within the Canada-wide system. On the workforce, that's been an area that Ontario has not made significant progress. Yes, we've got a wage floor in place now, but we do not have a wage grid, as we've seen in other provinces and territories, or a benefit or pension plan in place. And as a result, we had an Auditor General's report in Ontario earlier in the fall that found Ontario is now short 10,000 registered early child educators to meet the targets that they have. And so, similar to what Sharon was saying in British Columbia, here in Ontario, there are lots of childcare programs that are not at capacity right now, not because they don't have the physical space, but because they do not have the workforce, because we haven't committed as a province to decent work and pay for early child educators and to a wage grid. So falling behind falling behind our own targets as a province and falling behind other provinces as well. On expansion, the same Auditor General's report found that Ontario is falling behind their target there, with only 75% of the spaces that they have promised to create. And of course, that doesn't even start to really meet the demand that there is for this very popular program in our province. And, on inclusion, if we look at inclusion in different senses, we know that many children with disabilities are excluded from childcare still. Our special needs resource programs are underfunded provincially, which means that, exclusion is still happening far too often in our programs. If we look at the, inclusion of an equity of low-income families into our system, Ontario still relies on a low-income fee subsidy system to subsidize childcare below that $22 cap. And the reality is those families still have to meet work and study criteria. There are barriers there to accessing childcare. And so it's still a very inequitable two-tier system when it comes to equity and inclusion for low-income families. So turning to the 1-year extension, we had started a countdown clock that said, if Ontario doesn't reach an agreement by March, we would be really falling behind and we'd see childcare fees skyrocket. So the 1-year extension certainly saves us from that peril. And for childcare operators and for municipalities that are service system managers, it provides some stability because really, in Ontario, those municipalities expect their allocations for next year in November, and we were going to miss that deadline. So it's good to see that stability for programs, certainly. But, I think what we saw with that 1-year extension is that both the federal and provincial governments were comfortable breaking a key affordability promise to families. Because in March, our childcare fees were supposed to go down to a cap of $12 to get to that average of $10 a day. And we're not going to meet that target, and the governments have broken that target. So what we need to see over the next year, because this is it's bought advocates time to make our case to governments, and it's bought governments time to get back to the table. They need to negotiate a longer, stronger agreement that meets their affordability targets, as well as expanding the program to reach more families. Because as Morna said, a program that's only reaching a small percentage of families is never going to be enough to meet our goal of a truly universal system. So our governments need to get back to the table, and that's certainly what, as advocates, we're going to be pushing them to do What we have at the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, we don't have a new video right now, but we do have a new group, a network of parents that we've been supporting to bring an authentic parent voice to childcare advocacy here in Ontario. So I think Rachel can share a link to Parents for Childcare, which is where Ontario families can join with other families who want to see the $10 a day system. They want to see us meet that goal, and they want to see the system strengthened and expanded here in Ontario. So that's one place that you can turn. And then if you want to see more about what our vision as the Ontario childcare community, what our vision is for childcare, you can read our roadmap to universal childcare in Ontario, which is on our website as well. And I think Rachel will probably share a link in the chat. But happy to get folks' questions and talk more about how we work together over the next year to make sure that we keep these governments held to account, that we actually work toward a childcare system with affordable fees for every family, decent work and pay for educators, and enough spaces for all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And there are a few questions and comments in the chat that have come up. Encourage anybody who has any specific question or general question to add them to the chat box. There have been questions, David, around the provisions in the 2025 federal budget with respect to infrastructure investment. I guess it's particularly capital investments in community infrastructure. You said that the parameters for those programs have not yet been defined, that perhaps there's some openings to make sure that these programs could be used to help access capital funds, or at least include capital expansion of childcare as part of community infrastructure. The same, I assume, would apply for housing, that there continues to be a federal commitment for the expansion of housing, although I think the support for non-market housing is not as much as the not-for-profit and public housing providers would have liked to see. But that's another opportunity for advocating to make sure that childcare is included in public infrastructure, including hospital infrastructure, housing infrastructure, community infrastructure, and so forth. What would your advice be on how to advocate for that kind of inclusion in infrastructure? And just before you answer that, I just want to point out the 2024 budget, because it relates to your comment of sunset clauses, that unless programs were renewed in the budget, existing programs that have expiry dates could just expire, and especially if they're considered social spending, because social spending apparently is going to be much more restricted than capital funding. But in 2024, there was a capital infrastructure program announced. It was a loan program to be administered through CMHC, that up to $1 billion in loans, or in, I guess, really securing loans for not-for-profit public providers would be available. And there was also a grant portion set aside to support that. It's not in the budget. It's not extended by this 2025 budget, but it not being in the budget does not eliminate that program from what I'm understanding. So maybe you can just clarify those 2 points. I guess it's still a big question though whether we actually will see the $1 billion loan program, because it was announced in 2024 and it's not out the door yet. But can you answer, if something's not in the budget, does that mean it's not there anymore, even if it was previously announced? And what about, how do we advocate and influence how community infrastructure investments can be used to support the expansion of childcare? It doesn't address the operational issue. As you were pointing out, we could end up, that doesn't give money for staffing, doesn't give money for other things like working conditions. But what about capital? What's your advice?
Yeah, I mean, to Sharon's point, this is the problem with childcare often is not the capital dollars. It might be more important than emergency rooms where capital dollars are almost irrelevant. I mean, it's just a pure staffing problem. We could certainly, I'm sure the sector could certainly use capital dollars. And so there's going to be building. It's going to involve particularly affordable housing. that the federal government now is going to build. Those projects we expect to be relatively small scale, more pilot project-y in scope. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't advocate for childcare centers to be part of those developments. There's going to be a lot of new spending in defense, potentially new construction, new bases, new ports. I'm not sure how much childcare could be incorporated into those. I mean, it's possible, I suppose. But I think in terms of advocating federally, we need to think about capital, not operating. And we need to move to the provinces for operating because the feds aren't going to provide it. They're not going to change their funding formula. So there may be opportunities. This new fund is very undefined. It has closed several other funds and in essence canceled a whole variety of applications that were in the queue, which seems like a terrible idea. But in any event, that's what's happening. So once more of those details come out, it may be that there's a fair amount of devolution of decision making, which may mean that cities are going to make these choices instead. And so this may not be advocacy to the federal government, it may be advocacy to your city council to spend the money on a childcare center, being part of a new community center, and that sort of thing. In terms of the programs that may have been introduced in previous years but weren't reiterated in this budget, no, that doesn't mean they're canceled. The concern, though, is that we don't know the full extent of the savings, quote unquote, that each one of the departments, notably ESDC, is going to show. Most of the savings at ESDC is going to be through program cancellation. So is one of those programs going to be, something related to childcare? It's possible. CMHC is also going to have to show 15% cuts in its operating expenditures. Will that mean it's going to cut the loans program? We don't know those details yet, so it could mean that, but we don't know that for sure. And so that's one of the dangers that we'll know more probably in the spring, or we'll start to get more detailed departmental plans of how departments are going to get to these cuts, particularly when it comes to program cuts, like which programs are they actually going to cut. We know some of them, but most of them we don't know at this point. It's just too general in the budget itself.
I
Morna,
have to unmute. Sorry about that. Carolyn, one of the things the Ontario government has been saying right from the get-go, when the federal government first introduced its proposal to build a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, and one of the reasons there was a delay in the Ontario government reaching its first agreement with the federal government is that it said there's not enough money, there's not enough federal money, or that it's not enough, certainly relative to what Ontario is already contributing. That was their first argument. More that they're already putting a lot more money because they fund full day 4- and 5-year-old kindergarten, and other provinces don't. So they should get a special funding arrangement taking that into account. Now the Ontario government is arguing there really is not enough money in federal transfers, and presumably the provincial government is not prepared itself to make up the difference to be able to meet its expansion targets, to be able to bring down to meet its commitment of which, by the way, originally it was to reach an average of $10 a day in September 2025. Then it moved to an average of $10 to March 31st, 2026. Now it's not even promising to ever bring it down to an average. They're saying unless there's more money. This is, I guess, a political and a strategic question. Do you think that advocates should be leveraging the provincial government's demand for more money to also put pressure on the federal government? And if we do that, does that leave the provinces off the hook?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good question, Morna. And, as a provincial childcare advocate, I never want to let the province off the hook. Right. Let's remember childcare is, primarily, if it's a provincial responsibility, it's been a provincial responsibility for years. Similar to what Sharon said in BC, our government has had a flatlined childcare budget themselves for years. They're not putting in more funding into childcare. But I think that the issue of the funding gap, now, I think that both actually the federal and provincial government have acknowledged that that is real here in Ontario, that there isn't sufficient money right now to reach all of the targets that were set in that initial action plan. And the one-year funding extension actually comes with $695 million more from the federal government, borrowed from the future, from future years, so that we can hold the line on fee reductions here in Ontario. But the truth is, what I don't think either government have acknowledged is that, is that really important economic research that, you spoke to at the beginning, which shows that, the childcare program pays for itself over time. And that's not just something we're pulling out of the bed. It's not a nice line. We're talking about, the 40,000 jobs that have been created in early learning and childcare, right? Which is what Jim Stanford found in his report last year. So we're talking about increased, women's labor force participation of mothers during those core workforce years, right? And those things are happening, and we're already seeing those happening. And so if both a provincial and federal government, thought about it and approached it as being an investment, I think they would find the money very quickly. We know, for example, that Ontario is already saving $200 million in their care tax credit spend because because families are now, having more affordable childcare, and they're claiming less to the provincial government in the care tax credit. So that's $200 million that Ontario is saving every year. Are they putting it back into childcare? No, we haven't seen that, right? So we need to see that happening. We need to see the province stepping up. And when when we see our provincial budget in the spring, they're always strong on infrastructure spending, but they're not strong on social infrastructure spending, which is what childcare is. So I think we need to see that in our next provincial budget. We need to see that in the next federal budget.
So we're going to really have to push hard, as I said, on provincial governments as well. Leila, one of the issues that is coming up a lot in the media and general discourse over the future of the $10 a day program is that maybe everybody shouldn't be paying the same. And maybe $10 is too low for higher income families. And also maybe we should go back to a system where low income families have their fees subsidized through a voucher system or a subsidy system, which is application based and income tested and so forth. As a an advocate, strong advocate and policy expert with respect to poverty reduction strategies, what is your position? What's the position of Campaign 2000 on the issue of parent fees? You did say a maximum of $10 and a sliding scale for low-income families. Do you then still continue to support the objective of a maximum of $10 a day? And would you be in favor of resisting attempts to try to raise parent fees and bring in some other system to give special assistance to low-income families?
That's a really important question, Morna. We're in favor of a vision where communities are built around very strong universal public services that everybody has access to. So I think about, our elementary and secondary school system. You have a school in every neighborhood. Every child has a right to be there. They're not adequately funded in Ontario, especially where I am at, but that is the vision. And so right now, Campaign 2000's vision is the $0 to $10 a day sliding scale model where people pay what they can on that scale. The ultimate vision is that it gets brought into this notion of strong public services, and that once that $0 to $10 a day model is there, we revisit to see, okay, now can we make it free for everybody? Carolyn in her initial opening remarks talked about the barriers to fee subsidy programs. Those are very real, very live barriers, and compounded for women who are fleeing abusive relationships, who are struggling in poverty, who have multiple children and very precariously attached to the labor market, are having extraordinarily hard times navigating these fee systems. So we would not be advocating for any kind of a two-tiered system. I talked about the wealth concentration. We have other mechanisms to redistribute wealth. And so instead of looking to increasing childcare fees for people who can afford to pay more, Campaign 2000 would rather see wealth taxes, on the top 1% being implemented, and those revenue being redirected into social programs, closing tax loopholes for people at the top, increasing corporate taxes. That is the vision that Campaign 2000 puts forward in those 58 recommendations. There's a number around the opportunity to redistribute wealth through a more progressive tax system. And, we've had 40 years of neoliberal policies, market-based policies. We know that, when you're talking about fee subsidies and credits to families, that is, under this false notion of choice, it's telling parents, go and find childcare that works for you. But the market has shown us over and over again in childcare, in housing, in healthcare, that the market won't meet our needs because it's profit based. So we absolutely do not advocate for that kind of a system. You're still muted, Morna.
Not sure if I'm control or not. Sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not. Okay. Sorry about that. Sharon, we have 2 minutes left, and I really want to give you an opportunity for the last word here. Before I do that, I just want to point out the terrible decision of the Alberta government to eliminate the subsidy system, to put in place a flat fee of $15 and eliminate any supports, go way past, reject the sliding scale concept so that low-income families are actually paying much more now as a result of the $15 a day flat fee. It's terrible policy, terrible public policy, inequitable, and bad economic policy. And that's what I want to lend on, Sharon, is economic policy. We know that there are many arguments for strong in public investments in a system, a high quality system of early learning and childcare. You had Jim Stanford do some work on that, demonstrating the returns. You showed that, as you say, I'm not sure completely support the language of profiting, the public government profiting from childcare, but it certainly is getting more back in the way of returns to the provincial government in various forms than it is spending, as I understand it. How powerful are those arguments? And do you think, although we know childcare is the answer to every woe, and it's so important to social equity, gender equity, to families, are the economic arguments persuasive? And do you think we need to continue to make them?
I think we have to focus on two things. There is absolutely no question that our government is only going to listen to an economic argument. They don't seem to care that it's the right thing to do for kids or gender equity, family affordability. That really pales in comparison to having the economic argument, which is why the economist Jim Stanford's work was so important for us to lift up. But the economic argument alone is not enough. We still have to make the appeal to hearts and minds with personal stories. And so it is the stories about the benefit, the life-changing benefit when families, particularly mothers, do have access to 10-a-day care, and the impacts when they don't. And so those personal stories are fundamental to the campaign that leads with the economics and backs it up with the personal stories. And those two pieces are absolutely necessary for us to continue to move the needle and not slip further back.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Sharon. Wise words coming from a very powerful childcare campaign. I know that it's hard to see BC in essentially last place after all those efforts, but the whole country is behind you to make sure that the BC government is pressured to do the right thing. As was common, there was a comment in the chat. Your video was fantastic. We could substitute BC for many other provinces' names, and even substitute Canada for BC. I said at the beginning, when there's scarcity of public support, of public funding, it potentially is divisive. But I think we are a united movement. We're going to push together for stronger public investments in it to make the system high quality and good for staff, good for educators, good for parents, good for children, and of course beneficial to everybody through strong economic returns. So thank you everybody for participating. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for joining us for this last hour and a few minutes. We will be distributing the recording of this in English and French to participants, and we will also be posting it. Thanks, and let's just keep at it, not get discouraged. There's a spring financial update that the federal government will deliver. Let's make sure that childcare is part of that. Thank you very much.